January 17th, 1951. The frozen tarmac of Pope Air Force Base, North Carolina, stretched endlessly beneath a pale winter sky. The air smelled of aviation fuel and cold metal. In the pre-dawn darkness, the rumble of engines, deep, mechanical, relentless, vibrated through the bones of every man standing on that concrete expanse. Rows of C-119 flying boxcars and C-124 Globemasters sat like sleeping titans, their massive cargo doors yawning open to swallow jeeps, howitzers, ammunition crates, and whole battalions of men. Paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, adjusted their harnesses and checked their equipment with the quiet efficiency of soldiers who knew their role in history was about to be written. They did not know that across the Atlantic, in the smoke-filled rooms of Soviet military headquarters, their counterparts would soon be staring at intelligence reports with expressions of disbelief and dread. They did not know that what they were about to accomplish would shake the foundations of Cold War strategy and force the Kremlin to recalculate the balance of power in Europe. They only knew the order: deploy. Fast. Now. This was Operation Swarmer, though its true codename, Exercise Longhorn, would later be declassified. But before that, before the official records and the sanitized military briefings, there was only the raw, thunderous reality of American industrial and logistical supremacy made manifest in steel and speed. For 3 days in January 1951, the United States demonstrated to the world, and particularly to the Soviet Union, a capability so audacious it bordered on the fantastical: the ability to move an entire combat-ready division, more than 16,000 soldiers, their vehicles, their artillery, their ammunition, their very war-making capacity, across an ocean and deploy them operationally in under 72 hours. To the Soviet generals who had spent years calculating troop movements by rail, by convoy, by the grinding, exhausting arithmetic of distance and time, this was not merely impressive, it was terrifying. The world in 1951 was not at peace. The ink on the documents ending World War II had barely dried when the Cold War ignited, turning former allies into adversaries, separated by an iron curtain that cut through the heart of Europe. The Soviet Union, bloodied but victorious after the catastrophic losses of the Great Patriotic War, had extended its reach across Eastern Europe, installing communist governments from Warsaw to Budapest, from Prague to East Berlin. Joseph Stalin, paranoid and calculating, saw in Western Europe a collection of weakened nations ripe for ideological conversion or military intimidation. The United States, meanwhile, had demobilized rapidly after 1945, reducing its army from over 8 million men to barely 1.5 million by 1950. The nuclear monopoly, brief and fragile, had evaporated when the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949. Suddenly, the arithmetic of deterrence shifted. Conventional forces mattered again. The question became not whether war would come, but how quickly forces could be brought to bear when it did. The Korean War, erupting in June 1950, had already exposed uncomfortable truths about American readiness. The initial North Korean offensive pushed unprepared US and South Korean forces into the desperate perimeter at Pusan. Equipment was outdated, training was insufficient, the logistics of projecting power across the Pacific had nearly broken under the strain. And if this was the challenge in Korea, what would it mean for Europe, where Soviet tank divisions outnumbered NATO forces by staggering margins? The Pentagon planners looked at maps and saw nightmare scenarios: a Soviet thrust westward through the Fulda Gap, overrunning West Germany before reinforcements could arrive. The Atlantic Ocean, once America's greatest defensive moat, now became a logistical chasm that had to be bridged not in weeks, but in days. The concept of rapid strategic airlift was not new, but the scale required was unprecedented. During World War II, airborne operations had captured the imagination. Market Garden, the drop into Normandy, the relief of Bastogne. But these were tactical deployments, measured in battalions and regiments, not entire divisions. The Berlin airlift of 1948 to 1949 had proven that sustained aerial supply was possible, delivering millions of tons of food and coal to a blockaded city. But that was a static operation, a logistical marathon, not a sprint. What the Pentagon envisioned now was something different: the ability to move a fully equipped, combat-ready division from American soil to a European battleground faster than the Soviets could react. It was a deterrent made of speed and steel, a message written in the contrails of transport aircraft. We can be anywhere, anytime, and you cannot stop us before we arrive. Soviet doctrine, born from the brutal lessons of the Eastern Front, relied on mass and momentum. Red Army strategy envisioned vast armoured columns supported by artillery barrages, overwhelming defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. Movement was calculated in kilometres per day, logistics in tons of supplies moved by rail and truck convoy. The Soviet General Staff understood air transport, of course. They had used it in desperate resupply missions during the war. But the idea of using it as a primary method for deploying entire divisions seemed wasteful, even irrational. Aircraft were vulnerable, expensive, dependent on air bases and weather. Rail was reliable, methodical, proven. When Soviet intelligence officers first received reports in early 1951 that the Americans were planning a large-scale airborne exercise involving the transatlantic deployment of an entire division, the initial reaction was skepticism. Propaganda, perhaps, a bluff designed to mask weaknesses elsewhere. But as the intelligence accumulated, satellite imagery was still years away, but human intelligence, signals intercepts, and open-source reporting painted a picture. The skepticism began to curdle into concern. The soldiers of the 82nd Airborne Division did not think in terms of grand strategy as they boarded the aircraft that cold January morning. They thought about their equipment, their buddies, the mission. Many were veterans of World War II or Korea, men who had jumped into hostile fire and survived. Others were fresh, their jump wings newly pinned, eager and terrified in equal measure. They had trained for this. Endless drills, mock deployments, parachute jumps in all conditions. But training is one thing, and reality is another. The orders were clear. They would fly across the Atlantic, refuel in Iceland or the Azores, and land in Germany. Once there, they would assemble, move to designated positions, and demonstrate operational readiness. The entire process, from wheels up in North Carolina to combat ready in Bavaria, was to take no more than 72 hours. It was a logistical ballet choreographed with military precision, and every dancer knew that a single misstep could unravel the entire performance. The flight itself was an ordeal. The C-119 flying boxcar, workmanlike and ungainly, was not built for passenger comfort. The interior was cavernous, cold and loud, the twin engines roaring in a constant metallic scream that made conversation nearly impossible. Soldiers sat on canvas seats along the fuselage walls or on top of cargo pallets, wrapped in jackets and blankets, trying to sleep, trying to ignore the turbulence that jolted the aircraft like a ship in a storm. The Atlantic crossing took hours. Some flights stretched to 12 or 14, depending on weather and routing. There were no windows for most men, only the dim glow of cargo lights and the occasional shudder of the aircraft as it punched through clouds. They ate cold rations, drank lukewarm coffee from thermoses, and waited. For many, this was the first time they had flown over an ocean. The vastness of it, the sheer distance separating them from home, pressed down like a physical weight. They were leaving America behind, hurtling toward a continent still scarred by war, still bristling with Soviet divisions just beyond the wire. In Soviet military headquarters in Moscow and East Berlin, the reports began to pile up. American transport aircraft, dozens of them, were in the air. Not cargo flights, not isolated deployments, but a sustained aerial convoy moving westward across the Atlantic. The scale was staggering. By the end of the first day, Soviet intelligence estimated that more than 100 aircraft had departed American air bases. By the end of the second day, advance elements of the 82nd Airborne were landing in Germany, unloading vehicles and equipment and moving to assembly areas. The speed was beyond anything the Soviet planners had calculated. Rail movements of equivalent forces would have taken weeks. Even the most optimistic estimates for road convoy deployment assumed 10 to 14 days. The Americans had done it in less than 3. The symbolism was not lost on the Soviet leadership. The Red Army had bled and died to defeat fascism, losing upwards of 27 million people in the process. The Soviet Union had clawed its way back from the edge of annihilation, rebuilt its shattered cities, and forged an empire from the ruins. But all of that sacrifice, all of that blood, had not given them the one thing the Americans seemed to possess effortlessly: abundance. The sheer material wealth of the United States, its capacity to produce aircraft by the hundreds, to train pilots and crews, to stockpile fuel and spare parts, to coordinate a transatlantic airlift as if it were a routine training exercise. This was the real threat. Not the atomic bomb, though that was terrifying in its own right. Not the rhetoric of democracy versus communism, though that provided the ideological framework. The real threat was the realization that the United States could afford to move armies the way the Soviet Union moved freight trains. And if they could do it once, they could do it again. Anywhere. Anytime. The American soldiers landing in Germany saw a landscape still haunted by the war that had ended 6 years earlier. The cities were patchworks of reconstruction, new buildings rising beside bombed-out husks. The German people, weary and wary, watched the American convoys with expressions that mixed relief and resignation. To the Germans, the Americans were both occupiers and protectors, a paradox born of necessity. To the American soldiers, Germany was a frontier, the front line of a new conflict that had not yet turned hot but felt inevitable. They dug in, established perimeters, coordinated with local commanders, and waited for orders. The exercise called for them to simulate defensive operations, to prove that a rapidly deployed airborne division could hold critical terrain against a hypothetical enemy thrust. The hypothetical enemy, of course, was no mystery. Every soldier knew who they were preparing to fight. What the Soviet generals saw in those 72 hours was a nightmare scenario come to life. The Americans had not merely moved troops, they had moved an entire warfighting capability. The 82nd Airborne arrived with jeeps, trucks, anti-tank guns, mortars, machine guns, radio equipment, medical supplies, ammunition, everything needed to sustain combat operations. The logistical tale, that endless chain of supply that had bogged down every army in history, had been condensed and accelerated. Soviet doctrine assumed that even if NATO forces could delay a Red Army advance, the delays would be measured in hours, maybe a day or two, before reinforcements could arrive. Now, that assumption was shattered. If the Americans could deploy a division in 72 hours, how long before they could deploy 2, 3, an entire corps? The calculations that had underpinned Soviet war planning suddenly looked dangerously optimistic. There was a recurring object in the experience of those American soldiers that became, in its own way, a symbol of the gulf between East and West. Coffee. Not just any coffee, but the ubiquitous, scalding, bitter coffee that flowed from thermos jugs and mess tents, always available, always hot. To the American GI, coffee was as essential as ammunition. It was fuel, comfort, routine. It represented the unbroken supply chain that stretched back across the ocean to farms in Colombia and Brazil, roasted in factories in New York and Chicago, packaged and shipped and delivered even to the front lines. Soviet soldiers, by contrast, made do with tea, often weak and lukewarm, or with chicory substitutes when supplies ran low. It was a small thing, perhaps trivial in the grand calculus of war, but it was also emblematic. The Americans could afford to care about coffee. They could afford to ensure that every soldier, even those deployed halfway around the world in less than 3 days, had access to something as mundane and comforting as a hot drink. It was abundance made tangible, a daily reminder that the industrial and agricultural might of the United States was not just a statistic, but a lived reality. The Soviet military attachés who observed the exercise, officially as guests, though everyone understood their true role, filed detailed reports. They noted the condition of the equipment, the morale of the troops, the efficiency of the logistics. They counted aircraft, estimated fuel consumption, calculated the tonnage of supplies delivered, and they reported back a conclusion that chilled the Soviet High Command. The Americans had not been bluffing. This was not propaganda or theatre. This was capability. The United States possessed the means to rapidly reinforce Europe in the event of war, and no amount of Soviet armor could move fast enough to preempt that reinforcement. The window of opportunity for a quick, decisive strike, if it had ever truly existed, was closing. For the American soldiers, the exercise was both exhausting and exhilarating. They had proven something, not just to the Soviets, but to themselves. They had been told they were the tip of the spear, the rapid reaction force that would hold the line until the rest of the army could mobilize. Now they had demonstrated it. The flights home were quieter, the mood reflective. They had seen Germany, walked the same roads where their fathers and uncles had fought 6 years earlier. They had felt the weight of history, the proximity of danger. And they had learned that speed, more than firepower or numbers, was the new currency of deterrence. In the years that followed, the lesson of Operation Swarmer, or Exercise Longhorn, as it was officially known, would be repeated and refined. The creation of the Military Air Transport Service, the development of larger and more capable aircraft like the C-141 Starlifter and later the C-5 Galaxy, the establishment of forward bases and pre-positioned equipment, all of these flowed from the realization that rapid strategic mobility was not a luxury, but a necessity. The Soviet Union, for its part, would invest heavily in its own airlift capabilities, but never with the same success. The structural inefficiencies of a command economy, the prioritization of heavy industry over consumer goods, the reluctance to invest in what was seen as a secondary capability, all of these factors conspired to leave Soviet airlift perpetually lagging behind. The Americans had seized an advantage, and they would not relinquish it. The transformation in thinking was profound. Before 1951, American military strategy in Europe assumed a slow, grinding build-up, weeks or months of transatlantic convoy operations, while outnumbered NATO forces fought a desperate delaying action. After 1951, the calculus shifted. Rapid reinforcement became feasible, and with it, the possibility of halting a Soviet offensive before it could achieve momentum. This, in turn, changed Soviet planning. The easy victories that might have been possible in the immediate post-war years, when American forces in Europe were token and underprepared, were no longer assured. The risk of failure, of triggering a broader conflict that could escalate to nuclear exchange, increased. And so, paradoxically, the demonstration of American airlift capability became a force for stability, a deterrent that made war less likely because it made victory less certain. There was poetry in the speed of it, a kind of terrible beauty in the sight of 100 aircraft rising from American soil and descending on Europe like a steel rain. The soldiers who participated carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. They would tell their children and grandchildren about the cold flight across the Atlantic, the roar of engines, the landing in a foreign country still scarred by war. They would speak of the pride they felt, the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves, a demonstration of American resolve and capability that resonated far beyond the 72 hours of the exercise itself. And in their stories, always, there was the coffee, the hot, bitter coffee that tasted like home, that reminded them of diners and kitchens and ordinary life, even as they prepared for the possibility of extraordinary violence. The Soviet generals who studied the operation came away with a grudging respect, mixed with fear and frustration. They understood what the Americans had achieved, even if they could not replicate it. They saw the implications, the strategic shift that rapid airlift represented, and they adjusted their plans accordingly, not by abandoning the doctrine of mass and momentum, but by recognizing that the window for its application was narrower than they had hoped. The Cold War would continue for decades, punctuated by crises and near misses, but the balance of forces in Europe was fundamentally altered by those 3 days in January 1951. The Americans had proven they could respond, and respond quickly, and that knowledge shaped every Soviet calculation thereafter. In the decades that followed, the world would see other demonstrations of American airlift capability: the rapid deployment to Saudi Arabia at the start of the Gulf War, the sustained operations in Afghanistan, the humanitarian missions in the wake of natural disasters. Each time, the lineage traced back to that cold January when the 82nd Airborne boarded aircraft in North Carolina and landed in Germany 72 hours later. The technology improved, the aircraft grew larger and more efficient, the logistics more sophisticated, but the core principle remained the same: speed is strategy, and the ability to be present, in force, before the enemy can react, is the ultimate deterrent. The recurring image, the symbol that tied it all together, was that cup of coffee. Not the aircraft, impressive as they were, not the paratroopers, brave and skilled though they undoubtedly were, but the simple, mundane, everyday miracle of a hot drink, available to every soldier, no matter how far from home. It was a small thing, but it represented everything the Soviet system could not match: the abundance, the efficiency, the unshakable supply chain that stretched across oceans and continents without breaking. It was the promise of American democracy made tangible, the idea that a free society, with its messy markets and competing interests, could produce more, move faster, and care better for its citizens and soldiers than any command economy ever could. And that promise, delivered in steel and speed and scalding coffee, was what the Soviet generals saw in those 72 hours, and what they feared most of all. As the last aircraft landed and the soldiers of the 82nd Airborne settled into their positions in Germany, the world turned a page. The Cold War would continue, the standoff would persist, but the terms of engagement had changed. The Americans had proven that distance was no longer a barrier, that the Atlantic Ocean was not a moat but a highway, and that the deterrence of rapid response was as powerful as any weapon in the arsenal. The Soviet generals filed their reports, updated their war plans, and looked eastward with new calculations in their minds. And in mess tents across Germany, American soldiers drank their coffee, savoured the warmth, and knew, without needing to be told, that they had just changed the world. The epilogue of Operation Swarmer is written not in the archives of military history, though those records are meticulously preserved, but in the lived experience of deterrence, in the wars that did not happen because the cost of starting them became too high. It is written in the cold arithmetic of logistical capability, in the knowledge that speed and abundance, combined, create a form of power that no amount of ideology or sacrifice can overcome. The Soviet Union would eventually collapse, undone by the contradictions of its own system, unable to match the pace of innovation and production that the West sustained year after year. And when historians looked back, seeking to understand how the Cold War was won without becoming a hot one, they would point to moments like this: not the grand summits or the nuclear brinkmanship, but the quiet, relentless demonstration of capability, the proof that freedom, with all its inefficiencies and contradictions, could still outproduce, outmaneuver, and outlast tyranny. In the end, the lesson was simple and profound. An army that can move at the speed of thought, that can cross oceans in hours instead of weeks, that can drink hot coffee on a frozen German airfield 72 hours after leaving home, is an army that cannot be defeated by surprise or momentum alone. It is an army that represents not just military might, but the industrial, technological, and logistical superiority of an entire society. And that, more than any single battle or campaign, was what won the Cold War. Not the soldiers, brave as they were, not the generals, skilled as they were, but the system that could produce the aircraft, train the pilots, coordinate the logistics, and deliver the coffee. That was the true shock, the real revolution, and the enduring legacy of those 72 hours in January 1951, when America airlifted an entire army to Germany and stunned the world.